like religions, changed behavior towards literacy. And in that sense, I think it's more of a word ethic than a work ethic. Once you get literacy spreading, behavior changes regardless of the cultural setting. So one of the things I try to argue is that if you look at China today, you can see a work ethic in China which is really putting us to shame in the West. And that doesn't really come out of any deep Protestant tradition, although it's interesting that Protestant churches are making great headway in the most entrepreneurial cities in China, places like Wenzhou. So I think Weber was right that there is some kind of link between a certain system of beliefs that we associate with Protestantism and a changed behavior when it comes to work. But I don't think it's an exclusively Protestant thing. In fact, I think it can work just about anywhere when the incentives change. And if it's all, in a way, it's all about incentives and the way that institutions create incentives to work harder, to inquire freely. I mean, you began by saying it's about freedom, isn't it? And I think in the end it is. But what I'm really identifying are the institutions that promote economic freedom, scientific freedom to inquire, and political freedom.
Do we still have the work ethic?
Well, no, is the sad answer. Certainly not in Europe. If you look at Europe, the extraordinary thing is the decline of working hours per year, as well as the decline in the quality of work that's done and the rising share of people who don't work at all. The best statistic to illustrate this point, Steve, is that the average German now works 1,000 hours a year less than the average South Korean. And that's why when you go on vacation, the Germans are already there. And when you leave, they stay, because they take enormously long holidays, even compared with North Americans. But even here, I think we're seeing a kind of decline of work. Working hours are not as high as they used to be. And many people are in a position of not being able to work as much as they want to.
Neil, I'm showing this for the camera because anybody who carries one of these things around is going to be saying to himself right now or herself right now, what do you mean we don't work as much? We seem to be tethered to work 24/7 these days.
Yeah, but in fact, if you take a look at working hours per year, the West is now significantly behind the East Asian societies. Even if you take the most elastic view of work, which includes checking your BlackBerry when you're in the loo, I'm not sure that's work quite as Max Weber understood it.
Okay, fair enough. Consumer society. How has the development of the consumer society been such an advantage for the West?
This sounds a little trivial compared with modern medicine or the scientific revolution, but it's actually hugely important because without a consumer society, there's no point having an industrial revolution. I was trying to work out how to make the industrial revolution more interesting because it's one of those things that in history is kind of boring but important. If you put it purely in terms of technological innovation, spinning jennies and all that stuff, most students zone out. But then it occurred to me that if I put it in terms of the products, the clothes that you can make far more efficiently with mechanized industry, then people would get it. So I started to ask my students, when was the last time you bought an article of clothing? And it was nearly always last week. And I said, well, that's what I'm talking about. The consumer society is about having loads of clothes. And there's no point having an industrial revolution until you have such a society. Because why bother lowering the unit price of something like this shirt I'm wearing? That's what the industrial revolution does. It just makes this really cheap. There's no point in doing that if the appetite for clothing is not almost infinitely elastic. And trust me, it is. If you don't believe me, take a look at my teenage daughter's wardrobe.
Well, I think you said in the book, blue jeans have been one of the significant battlers of totalitarianism around the world.
You know, blue jeans are an amazing thing, that they are a transformative but amazingly simple piece of consumer art. When you think about it, one of the most amazing things about the Cold War is that a very simple pair of workman's pants, because that's all that jeans are, I mean, designed for Californian prospectors, made to be hard wearing, made out of a pretty cheap but durable fabric, held together by rivets. This simple thing takes the world by storm as a fashion item in the post-1945 period. And that is interesting because it shouldn't be hard to make those. And yet the Soviet system, which was a kind of mutant outgrowth of Western civilization based on the egalitarian theories of Karl Marx, the Soviet Union couldn't do it. It couldn't make blue jeans. The centrally planned economy could make atomic weapons, but it couldn't make Levi's. And that turned out to be a fatal flaw in the design of that Soviet system.
Well, speaking of fatal flaws, do you think the debt levels that consumers are now carrying, what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, should we still consider consumerism a strength, given the kinds of debts we're all carrying these days?
I think that's a great question, Steve, because I think in this, as in so many respects, the killer apps are not working as well as they used to. Our consumer society maxed out, especially in the United States, but also actually throughout the English-speaking world, on excess household debt. Now, Max Weber's concept of a work ethic was also a thrift ethic, and you can't really have a stable consumer society without saving. We decided we would experiment to see if we could have a zero savings rate in the United States and have households not only spend all that they earn, but go beyond that and actually borrow to increase the firepower. Well, we know how that ended, and it ended with one of the biggest financial crises of modern times. And that's one of the ways in which I think the West has come off the rails in recent years. The 30 biggest shopping malls in the world today, only 3 of them are in the United States. The rest are in emerging markets. I don't think the consumer society lives here anymore. I think it's in its death throes in that excessively leveraged English-speaking world.
One quote from your book here: "Civilizations are complex things. For centuries they can flourish in a sweet spot of power and prosperity, but then, often, quite suddenly, they can tip over the edge into chaos." Let's finish up on this. Are you worried about the future of Western civilization?
Yes, I am, and I'm worried that we complacently assume we should be worrying about decline, which is a kind of gradual sounding thing. Maybe our problems will get serious in 2050, but let's leave that for Junior to worry about. That is not how things work in history. I was really struck as I was writing the book by the number of collapses I encountered, all the way back from ancient Rome, which fell apart really quickly in the 5th century, through the Aztecs and the Incas, looking at what went wrong with imperial Spain, looking at the way the Ming Empire fell apart, and then the Qing dynasty after that. And what occurred to me was that things happen really fast. Collapse rather than decline is what you need to worry about. And when one watches what's happening in Europe today, the speed with which the project of European integration is unraveling, I think there's a warning there for North America. Excessively indebted public sectors can implode in ways that right now most of us appear not to expect.
Are we just not paying enough care and attention to the institutions that have got us to where we are today?
Yeah, I think that is the problem. I mean, for example, if you look at the quality of public education in the US, high schools are really poor compared with their Asian competitors. They do not get people to an adequate standard of numeracy when they leave high school. Or look at the rule of law. That used to be really good in the English-speaking world. Now it's a nightmare. In fact, ask anybody trying to do business in the United States, what is your biggest headache? The answer is not, in fact, government. The answer is the lawyers and the compliance department and all the kind of hidden burdens that are imposed by an excessively litigious and over-regulated system. So we have a lot of institutional problems right now, and I think these are there on both sides of the Atlantic, so they're Western phenomena generally, and we're not addressing them. In fact, we're often arguing about completely the wrong things. I'm absolutely sure there's a problem of inequality in Western societies right now, but we're misdiagnosing it. We're not recognizing that one reason that the bottom 20% of the population is getting poorer is globalization and the competition that we are now encountering from countries like China.
Having said that, they want to be like us. They still do. And they want in on our institutions. And they're creating some of their own to mirror what we've got. So do we really need to be that fearful that we're going to be overcome? It sounds like they want to be part of the game with us.
Up to a point. Remember, the Chinese economy will probably overtake that of the US within 5 years to become the biggest in the world. And China has downloaded most of the killer apps, but not all of them. China does not want a system based on private property rights and representative government. It doesn't really want the rule of law as we understand it. And it certainly doesn't want freedom as we understand it. So anybody who wants to sit back complacently and say, why should we worry, they're becoming like us, hasn't spent enough time in China. This is a kind of partial download of Western institutions. It's Asian fusion that we're seeing here, not pure Westernization. And a world in which China is the number one power will be a lot less congenial and comfortable than a world in which the United States was the number one power. People underestimate that at their peril.
Civilization, the West and the Rest. Niall Ferguson, great to have you here at TVO again. Thanks for the book, a really great read.
Thank you, Steve.